Hello again, folks, and thank you for joining us on your weekend. We don't do as many shows on the weekend, but it's just the way it fell this time. And we are continuing our examination look at the Holocaust and another story of a personal story with regards to the Holocaust. Dr. Chris Millington, of course, on Friday ran through, on Thursday, ran through the Holocaust experience of France as a nation. So lots of data, lots of statistics, very, very good presentation. Then Noemi and Derek continued with their story of their families' involvement on both sides of the horrors. And today we continue that theme of a personal story. My guest is Debra Barnes, who's joining me from London, who wrote a novel, but drawing on the experience of her mother's survival of the experiences of World War II, which we will elaborate on in the show. So good evening, Debra. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Very good, thanks.
So, you know, as we always, I start by asking my guests, you know, we were talking before going live, the Holocaust is a big subject, lots of discussions on Twitter about people should be knowing more about it, but the difficulty of learning about, the difficulty of talking about it if you've got a personal experience or if you haven't got a personal experience. But in your case, you know, you came from a background of journalism. You knew you had this family story within your you know, your circle, but you took quite a while before you wanted to put anything down to paper and talk about it. What was the moment for you that you decided you want to explore this story and share it with other people?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, growing up, I knew that my mother was a Holocaust survivor, and I knew that we had a photograph, which I'll just show you here. So we had this family photograph. It was in a much nicer frame, my parents' house. And I knew that the couple in the photo were my grandparents, who I never got to meet, and that of the 5 children, one was my mother, and the others, only 2 others survived, and 2 children didn't survive the Holocaust. But we really didn't know anything else. Mum never spoke about it, and we didn't want to upset her, so we never asked. Also, we realized that she was very young during the war and had obviously suffered some trauma, and it was just a subject that was avoided. This kind of changed in around 2006, really. And I don't know if you want to show the first picture.
We can do that.
So, incredibly, one of my cousins in America was doing some research, some family research on the internet. And we knew that my mother was in an orphanage for Jewish children in a place called Louveciennes, which is just outside Paris. And my cousin was searching the name Louveciennes, and this is one of the results that came up. And this is obviously the front cover of a book. And I'm sure that you will be able to translate the title. But for anybody watching who doesn't speak French, the title translates to "I Will Never Forget You, My Children of Auschwitz," and written by Denise Holstein. And incredibly, and I don't know, I still can't understand how she managed to do it, but my cousin recognized that one of the children standing on the back row, thank you, was my mother. So she is the one with the short hair. And no, not that. Yes, yeah, that one in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
No, in the middle.
Yeah, there we go.
In the middle, thank you. And she'd obviously had head lice, we assume, before this photograph was taken, and that's how they dealt with it in those days. They just shaved everyone's hair off. And to her left, also on the back row, was her twin sister. So my mother's name was Paulette, and her twin sister was Annette. Okay, so if you go to the next photograph in the slide. Okay, so this is the original photograph from that front cover. And Denise, who wrote the book, is on the right, my right, the older girl wearing the white blouse with the yellow star. Okay, and Denise was obviously Jewish. She was wearing the yellow star. She was also an orphan. And this photograph was taken on the steps of the orphanage in Louveciennes, and I can date it to spring or very early summer 1944. and Denise had the responsibility of looking after this group of children who were the youngest children in the orphanage. And she wrote in her book that all of the children in this photograph died at Auschwitz. So she had no idea that my mother was still alive.
Wow.
Yeah. So my mother, my cousins sent my mum the photograph. My cousins in the States sent my mum the photograph of the front cover of the book, and my mum was shocked. I mean, she'd never seen a photograph. She'd never seen this photograph, and she'd never seen a photograph of herself at that age because she had nobody to take photographs of her. So, as I said, we never talked about the Holocaust and in our family, but finding this book and realizing that there was someone who was alive who might be able to tell me some more about what happened to my mum, Denise, really made me like want to know more. But still, I didn't start my research quite yet. But what did happen, well, I'll tell you what happened later, actually. But anyway, my mum, so this was around 2006, and my mum actually died in 2010. And it was only after she died, that's when I felt I could really start my research, okay, because I knew it wouldn't hurt her. I thought it would hurt her greatly for her to find out how the rest of her family had died, particularly her twin sister, because the connection between twins, you know, is something really special. And it's an incredible story. And that's why I knew I had to write a book about it. And that's how I came to write The Young Survivors. So that's kind of like the beginning of my story, really.
And it's just fascinating because it does mean that question that was on Twitter today about the teaching of the Holocaust has everyone wants to say yes, of course we should learn about it, but it's balanced with the fact that there are people surviving and people who are descendants of people who lived through something that was so horrific that in educating others about it, they have to be reminded of the horrors they went through. And that is a negative effect of educating others, is that you're now upsetting people who've, for whatever reason, they've put that chapter of their life behind them. They've moved on from it. They've come to terms with it, however they've done it on their own personal journey of. And when you're a child, in your mother's case, you know, as a child's brain is perhaps easier to blot out some of the negative stuff than someone a little bit older. And so you essentially start a new life separate from that old life. So I can completely understand and empathize with you the need to wait until a bit later to talk about it. And thank you, by the way, for sharing that with us, because it's always with the understanding of the Holocaust. If you look at large numbers, it just becomes overwhelming. You know, when you look at millions is just statistics. Millions, thousands is even just statistics. The human brain can't take in millions being killed, but it can take in a family being split into, some surviving and some failing to survive. That is an easier to understand and therefore more emotional connection with these events. So anyway, we'll carry on. You've got lots of PowerPoint images for us. You've got a couple of bits of film of interviews. I'm sure we'll have a very enlightening experience. So I'll hand over to you. And folks, if you've got your comments and questions for myself or for Debra, or just you might want to make a comment, please do that as we always go through the show. But other than that, I'll kind of hand over to Debra to continue with this, and we'll all learn something, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we go to the next picture. Okay, so this is the beginning of my mother's story. This is the Sklar's family in 1938. And this photograph was taken in Metz, which I don't know if you've been there, Paul, but it's...
No, I haven't.
Okay. I have. I'll tell you about that later. So the lady is was my grandmother, Cécile, and the gentleman was my grandfather, Tretel, although when he moved to France, he changed his name to Charles. My grandparents were born my grandmother in 1901, my grandfather in 1902. They were both from Poland, and they travelled independently to France around 1920, as did many Jews leave Poland because of persecution there. So they met in France and they married in 1924 and they settled in Metz and they started their family. So these three boys in the photograph are my uncles. The one at the back is the eldest, Jacques. The one standing in front of his mother is the youngest son, that's Nathan. And the one on the other side is the middle son, Jean. And the two baby girls sitting, who my grandfather is holding so proudly on his lap, were my mother, Paulette, and her twin, Annette. We don't know which one is which. We've tried to see, but we can't. And one thing I really want to point out about this photo that I really like is that my grandfather is so casual, because I've seen so many photographs from around this time of families, and obviously they had to go to a studio to take the portrait, and often the father is suited with a tie and a hat and looks so stiff and whatever. And obviously my grandfather was a very relaxed person, and apparently he was a champion amateur wrestler in his youth, and he's a burly man. He looks like he can look after himself, and I think that's another important fact, the fact that the victims were not all just victims. We see the photographs of the skin and bones, almost skeletons in the camps and everything, and these were strong people who just didn't stand a chance. So important to note that all five children were born in France and therefore were of French nationality. Okay, the family were living in Metz, which if you click again, it will come up there So obviously everything in purple up there is Germany. And once World War II started, families with young children who were living in Metz were relocated to other towns away from the German border. And at this point, it was for their own safety. My grandparents were lucky because they were one of few families who had a car. My grandfather used it for business. He was a clothing merchant, so he travelled around selling clothes. But they were a family of 7, and they also took my grandmother's elderly mother. So once everybody was in the car, there wasn't too much room for them to take all of their belongings, and most of them got left behind. So my grandmother packaged everything, left everything neat and tidy in the apartment. She washed the floors and made sure that it was as she wanted to find it when she returned. But she never returned. So first the family were sent to live in one place, and then they would move to another. And then in January 1940, they were sent to they were allocated a house in a small village called Virelais, which is just outside Poitiers, which you can see is over on the other side of the country. And actually this farmhouse they were to share with my grandmother's brother and his family. And there were other Jewish families from Metz who are relocated in the same area. Next picture, please.
Just to interrupt there, because I like interrupting, is the fact that the family left the apartment in good order is very telling, because it indicates that there is a sense of things will get back to normal. We'll go back there again at some other point. It's there because there's a sense that sometimes that the foreboding some people have that it was inevitable that the final solution was going to happen. But of course, at this point, no one or a lot of people didn't know it was going to get that far. Of course, they're worried. They're moving away, but the fact they think they're going to go back there, I think, is a very important fact to just kind of re-emphasize that they're believing this is a temporary situation that will resolve itself.
I mean, all families with young children were moved away from Metz, but there was a very large Jewish population there. So I don't know why that most of the families or all the families who were relocated in Poitiers were Jewish. It may have been, following someone's orders, but at the time, the Germans hadn't invaded yet. So, France hadn't surrendered yet. So. Yeah. So I think it was just that there was a large Jewish population, and that's where they went. And this is the farmhouse that they were allocated in Virelais outside Poitiers. And this is my Uncle Jean, the middle son, who I showed you in the photograph before. When they arrived, he was 11. And here he's a bit older.
Clearly.
He went back to visit. He was settled in the States. I'll tell you about that later. But he went back to visit, a few years ago now, and he went to see the house. So Virelais is one of those villages that's along a main road. It's the Route National 10. National, that's my Spanish coming up. The National 10 road in France. And it's one where it has houses on either side of the road, and that's about it. There was a school, there was a railway station, but the house that they were relocated to was actually a bit hidden. It was off the beaten track, if you like, and the adults in the family thought this was probably a good thing. And here I'm showing my mother and her twin, because they didn't care where they lived at this time. They weren't even 2 years old yet, so all they were interested in was eating and sleeping and playing. My grandfather wasn't able to carry on with his clothing business, and he offered to join the French army, but he was refused because he had a family to look after. So he went to work in a foundry helping to make aerial bombs for the French Air Force. And the local people in Virelais were friendly to their new Jewish neighbours. They sold them food. My uncles went to the local school. They played football with their new friends at the weekend, and everyone adjusted to life in this very small village, which was quite different to the big city of Metz that they'd come from. So a few months later, May 1940, Germany invaded France. I'm sure all your viewers know more about World War II than I do. And a month after, France surrendered to Germany. And then the armistice was signed between the two countries, which saw France divided into two. So the Germans occupied the north and west, which is the yellow zone, and there is Poitiers in the yellow zone, and the unoccupied zone, known as the Free Zone or Vichy France, which is in blue, would be under a new French government led by Marshal Pétain, a World War I hero, who was working in collaboration with the Germans. And if you show the next slide, it's a photo of Pétain meeting Hitler in 1940. So the occupying Germans took over many homes in towns and cities, but they pretty much ignored the village where my family were, because it really was that small and insignificant. And my Uncle Jean remembers that one day some German troops marched through, announced it under the control of the German army, and then marched on out again. Much to the relief of the people living there. In October 1940, the first racial law was passed, whereby Jews were forbidden to run a business. Restrictions were brought in about when Jews could visit shops, usually at the end of the day when there wasn't much left to buy, and they were prohibited from going to public places like parks or cinemas. And a curfew was brought in a bit later, and Jews all over the age of 6 had to wear a yellow star with the word Juif, Jew, in French. But still, my family managed to live relatively peacefully in this small village, which at that time seemed to have escaped much of what was going on outside. Although a year later, in October 1941, further racial laws were passed, gradually taking away more and more basic human rights from the Jewish people. They were no longer allowed to hold religious services. Now, tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, and then 8 days later is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And when these high holy days came around in 1941, my grandfather offered their remote farmhouse to be used as a secret synagogue. As I explained, it was a little bit off the beaten track. So I took advantage of when my Uncle Jean came to visit once, and I videoed him telling the story. And here is Jean telling us what happened at that time.
The next day we emptied the whole house of furniture, the top and the bottom, and then all the Jews in the area were notified they're going to be all the services. By that time, things were getting really bad. And the kids were not allowed in. There wasn't enough space. So we were outside, and we took all the furniture out, and all the people from the that came, men and women, and they started praying and crying. It was a horrible scene, because by that time, even I was a kid, I still didn't know what was going on. I mean, I knew it was bad with the Germans, but nobody knew that they were that bad. Anyway, they prayed and prayed, and as a footnote, that of all the people that prayed in that house, that Yom Kippur and that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there was just Mr. Russak and his son came back from a concentration camp, and then Paulette, myself, and Jack survived. And there must have been maybe over 100 people in that house. Nobody survived. Everybody consequently were all arrested, and nobody came back.
Wow. And just when you were interviewing your family, just the members, how difficult was it at this point for them to convey these things? Did they want to talk? Did your uncle want to talk, or was it a bit of a process to get him to explain these things?
No, my uncle, because he was that much older than my mum, he had a completely different experience during the war, and as did my other uncle, who had died I think around 1990, Jacques, the eldest. They both had completely different experiences, and my uncle Jean, for example, loves watching. Well, I have to tell him about your channel. He'd love it. I mean, the History Channel, and he's really interested in everything, and he loves talking about it. And he's written his own story, and he just it's completely different. So he was very happy. He was very, very happy to talk. My mum was sitting in the room, and occasionally she would be asking him things, because she really didn't. She just blotted it out, and she didn't know anything. She didn't know anything about what had happened. And of course, well, we're going to get to it, but there's a point where they are separated, and that's when I had to really do my research to find out what had happened to my mum, because there was no one left to tell me. Right. So here we go. So if you want to, no, can you go back one? Oh, no, sorry, forward one. You're right. And then click again. Okay. So that was what I just told you was October 1941, when they had this secret synagogue, and luckily nobody came along, to arrest them or anything, and everything was fine. But the following year, on the 16th of July 1942, that was the day of the roundups in Paris and all over France, and also where my grandparents were. So there was a knock on the door of the farmhouse. It was the middle of the night, and everyone was asleep. No one heard the truck of German soldiers and French police come down the gravel driveway, and they came and they arrested my grandfather that night. And their reason for him being arrested was that he was Jewish, and that was it. It was mid-July. Pack warm clothing, they told him. You'll need it where you're going. He was sent straight to Auschwitz. According to the Auschwitz database, my grandfather was dead just over 1 month later, on the 26th of August, 1942. He never needed those warm clothes that they told him to bring, but we know now that the arresting officers only told prisoners to bring warm clothing to give them a full sense of security, and so they'd hand themselves over without a fight. The cause of his death is given as kidney disease, but he was a healthy man. He was 40 years old, and he didn't have any kidney disease. We know the Nazis had a list of illnesses that they would choose from at random when recording the murder of their prisoners. And so this was the beginning of the destruction or the dissection of my mother's family. A few months later, obviously my grandmother was left completely destroyed after her husband was taken and never heard of again. About 3 months or 2.5 months later, on the 8th of October, 1942, an order was given for all Jews in the area to be arrested and sent to the internment camp in Poitiers. I want to go to the next slide. Click again.
Children born to foreign parents but of French nationality must not be arrested. However, children under the age of 6, even of French nationality, whose parents are to be arrested, must be left with their parents and consequently will be taken with them to the Poitiers camp. These arrests must be made on the night of October 8th and at the latest on October 9th.
So I hope you can hear that clearly. But basically they had these orders, and the French police and German soldiers came again to the farmhouse in the middle of the night, and they called out the names of of everybody in the house, including my grandmother and then my mother and her twin sister. That was because they were only 4 years old, and so they had to go with their mother. But in accordance with the order that they had been given to not arrest children over the age of 6, born to foreign parents, but themselves of French nationality, the police did not call out the names of my 3 uncles, Jacques, John and Nathan, who were then aged 17, 13 and 10, leaving them alone in the otherwise empty farmhouse. So the minute the curfew was lifted the next morning, Jacques, the eldest son, hurried to the Gestapo headquarters in Poitiers. He had no plan, but he knew he had to do something, anything. He knocked on the door of the office of the head of Gestapo and asked them to please release his young twin sisters who'd been arrested the night before and were taken here to the Poitiers transit camp. Well, the head of Gestapo looked curiously at my Uncle Jacques, who was, as I said, 17 years old at the time. And I don't know if you know the word, but I think he must have been surprised by his chutzpah.
Yep, very familiar.
Yes. But my uncle said he hadn't thought about what he was doing. He was just desperate to save his young, innocent sisters. What had happened is when his father had been arrested, my grandfather, they'd waited a few days before they tried to find out where he was, and then it was too late. So he literally went the first morning and, had no plan. But the Gestapo decided to play a little game with my uncle, and he set him a challenge, no doubt for his own amusement. He said to Jacques, and you're going to have to excuse my French and German pronunciation here. Next slide, please. There's a cafe in town called Le Jet d'Eau. Can you tell me what it would be called in German? Well, my Uncle Jack knew some German because he'd grown up in Metz and half the people there spoke the language, so he took a guess. He said, I think it would be called Waschenspritz in German. You are correct, said the Gestapo. Take this note to the French police and they will release your sisters. Well, as I said, this Uncle Jacques, died around 1990, I believe. But before he died, he gave his testimony to the Shoah Foundation. And that's where I learned this story. And when I heard it, I was a little bit skeptical because I thought that just sounds, incredible. Too amazing, really, to happen. But if you go to the next slide, you will see that a copy of that actual note was discovered at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. a few years ago. So it says the Jew, Sklas, anyway, my French is terrible, but it's basically giving...
Yeah, giving permission to be freed. I mean, so why do you think this Gestapo guy did this? I mean, I'm not going to give him any credit for being sympathetic. It doesn't really it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's just that it's such an odd part of the story, because I was going to make the point about when you talked about the police and the Gestapo arriving at the house, how it was sudden for your family, but it wasn't sudden in terms of the German organization, because they had been planning this for months before because of the censuses they were making the Jewish people in France fill out. They knew where they were. They were having to register here and there. And the roundups was happening all over Marseille, Paris, even rural Normandy, where I'm from. That same month, July, August 42, this was happening nationwide. So this is part of a very organized, deliberate process to remove the the Jews from France. And yet this act by a Gestapo guy is against this process. It doesn't. It's really curious.
Yeah. Well, if we go to the next slide, I've got my uncle Jacques telling us what happened next.
I went to the door, to the gate, and I gave the guard the papers, and I told him what it was. And he walked into the office over there, and sure enough, about a half hour later, the two girls came walking out, and my mother was at the gate, saying, take good care of them. And I put them in the wagon that I had attached to my bicycle.
Did you speak with your mother at this time?
I don't remember anymore. I'm talking about 1942.
Did you ever see your mother again after this?
No more. That was the end of it.
So the twins were allowed to leave, but their mother was not. And in a matter of days, my grandmother was sent to Drancy in Paris, and from there straight to her death in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. She was 41. The twins were 4, and so that was the last time they saw their mother. And now all the grown-ups had been deported, never to be seen again, and the 5 children were left at the farmhouse, ranging in ages from Jacques, who was 17, to the girls who were aged 4. And Jacques was thrown into the role of head of the family. He had to make all the decisions for them, very difficult decisions. He tried to do what was best for everyone and what he thought his parents would have liked him to do, and he wanted to keep everyone together, but it soon became clear that he wasn't able to look after them. But there was a kind neighbour, Catholic lady, who took in the twins, and the 2 middle brothers went to live with another Catholic family nearby. Jacques went to work, and then all the siblings got together at the weekend. So this continued until mid-1943, and then a letter arrived to the farmhouse ordering the 4 younger children to report to a Jewish children's home in Paris. If you want to go to the next video.
All right.
There was a letter from the French police came in and says that all children must report to Paris, to there was a Jewish agency, l'Union Générale des Juifs Français. And we have to stay there. They will not permit us to stay anymore in that area. That was also a big mistake, because what they were doing, they were, instead of grabbing the whole families in one piece, they were taking piecemeal. They take the father, the mother, and the one kid, and the others. That was the reason for their the way they were operating.
But Jacques was reassured that his brothers and sisters would be safe and well looked after there, so he made the arrangements to take them to Paris. And actually that's quite ironic as well, because Jews weren't allowed to travel at night, and the only train to Paris was a night train. So they actually had to take some tobacco to bribe the guards on the train to let them go to follow these orders. So anyway, they went to Paris, and they went to this children's home, which was right by, it was in Montmartre. I've been outside it, but it was just one of many children's homes full of Jewish children whose parents had been deported to the concentration camps. And effectively all these children were orphans, but of course they didn't know at the time. They all hoped that their parents would come home one day. So as I said, it was run by a Jewish organization, but under the watchful eye of the French police and German soldiers who were working in collaboration. So every few days, a German soldier would come with a list of the children to make sure they were all still there. But he wouldn't bother to see them himself or count them. You know, we know the Nazis ruled by fear, and if anyone was missing, the people running the home knew that they would be punished if any of the children had run away. So they made sure that didn't happen. If you click again, that was my mother and her twin. And again, that's Nathan, their brother. We've gone a bit to the side. And that's Denise, who wrote the book that I told you about at the beginning. Jean isn't there, the middle son, because he was 14. So after about a week, he was moved to a trade school in Paris because he was considered too old to be here. And that was the continuation of what he called the piecemeal dissection of the family. And now only the youngest brother, Nathan, and the two twin girls, my mum and Annette, were still together. If you have got a photo of them, click again.
Yep, there we go.
A few months later, these three were moved to an orphanage in a suburb outside Paris called Louvciennes, and that's where the photograph was taken from the front cover, which I've got again if you want to click. Let me show that. And as I said, one of the older children was assigned to be a monitor to look after the little ones, and that was Denise. Denise was very kind to the little children and became almost like a mother to them. So in June, the Allies landed in Normandy and advanced through France. And Denise told the children the good news that the war would soon be over. But until it did, they had to stay where they were and wait for somebody to come and take them home. And now I've got a short extract from Denise's book, which explains what happened a few weeks later.
All right, we'll do that.
On the morning of the 22nd of July at 6 o'clock, when there was not yet anybody in the streets of Louvciennes, I saw through the window of my room a German officer and some civilians making their way towards the house. I hastened to the office of the director, who received me coldly. But the officer was already there. He had come to arrest us, all of us. The house was surrounded. It was necessary to wake the children, dress them, and put their clothes and a little food in their blankets, for we did not have any suitcases. Apparently, the Germans were anxious that we left before inhabitants of Louvciennes awoke, so they could not witness this arrest of young children. They pushed us roughly onto a bus. The little ones didn't understand what was happening, and we told them we were going to the country. We encouraged them to sing. Me, I quickly realized we were going to Drancy. I was not too upset, for I knew that I would be reunited with old acquaintances. The end of the war was near. The Allies had landed in Normandy 6 weeks ago, and we would soon be free. On arriving at Drancy, however, I was a little less calm when I saw a large number of buses full of children. Then I realized that all the children's homes had been raided.
Yeah, so all the children's homes in and around Paris were raided, and 241 children were arrested that morning. The commanding Nazi officer said the reason was to exterminate future terrorists, while the French police considered the children to be evidence to prove the terrible crimes that they had collaborated with the Germans to carry out. They were the orphans left behind after their parents had been deported to the concentration camps. Drancy was the transit camp in Paris where Jewish prisoners were taken before being sent to the camps. It was the site of a large housing estate which was still being built when the Germans took it over. And as you can see from this photo, it was quite modern in design, very different from the wooden barracks of the concentration camps that we usually see in photographs. These were, in fact, the first high-rise apartment buildings built in France. And I always find it completely shocking to see this type of modern building being used as a Nazi prisoner camp.
Yeah, it doesn't connect with our preconceived ideas. And I want to just interrupt again about the, you know, when you refer to the establishment they were taken to as a children's home, and you know, it does convey some element of sympathy, because when we think of children's home, or I think of kind of often of kindly people looking after children. I know orphanage haven't always got a history of being kind, but you know what I mean. But what we're really finding out is this is just a means of the Germans streamlining the efficiency of their eventual program to get rid of everybody. It's just collect them in one place, and then when they're good and ready, when they've got the infrastructure or the transportation in place, they'll just move them when they want to the next stage. There's no sense of it being any kind of sympathetic act by the Germans. It's purely an administrative process to facilitate their I guess evil intentions of getting rid of these people. It's just purely about organizational logistics, isn't it?
Absolutely. And a similar thing happened to my uncle who went to the trade school. They found out that the rumor was that when there were enough, because they kept bringing children, more and more like older children there, when they had enough to fill their quota, they were going to cart them off to Drancy and onto the camps. And when my uncle found this out, he ran away and he escaped. So
it's purely about increasing their efficiency. It's just so that why send one truck for one person when you can send 10 trucks and day 200? It's more efficient, it's less gas, it's less fuel, less German soldiers. Everything becomes, from the German point of view, more streamlined. The more people you can move at one time, because as you said, you know, by this time the Germans are effectively losing the war. They're about to lose France. Their resources are running thin, so that they still want to carry out their persecution and extermination of a race, but if they can do it more efficiently, then that's to their benefit, and that makes the personal stories that you're sharing even the more harrowing, by knowing how organized this was. The Germans are losing the war, yet they're still systematically continuing with the policy. Just awful.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the children were actually sent. So 9 days after arriving at Drancy, these children were sent on convoy number 77, which is quite, I mean, they're all, you know, infamous, but convoy's number 77 was the last convoy to leave Drancy for Auschwitz. And there were a lot of children on it, and they were sent immediately to the gas chambers on arrival. Denise was with them, but she was saved because she was older, so she was selected as forced labour. But my mother's twin, Annette, age 6, and their brother Nathan, age 12, were murdered on arrival. And it was, as I said, the last train to leave Paris. Less than 3 weeks after the children were sent to their deaths, the Allies liberated Paris from the Nazis. Let me show this.
Paris is now free, and very free is Paris.
Yeah.
So you're probably thinking, well, how come I'm here? What happened to my mother? Because had she been with Annette and Nathan, she would have also been murdered, and I wouldn't be here to tell her story. Well, just a few days before the raids on the children's homes, my mother became ill with measles, and she was sent to hospital in case of complications. And that was the first time that she was ever separated from her twin sister. Now, the Nazis knew where she was. They had their lists, as you know, we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But bizarrely, they were quite scared of infectious diseases, and they waited a couple of days to go and get her from the hospital in Saint-Germain. And by the time they turned up there, the doctors had handed my mum over to some nuns to hide her in their convent. And that's how she managed to survive, through the kindness of those strangers and also the luck of having measles at the right time. And I have interviewed many, many Holocaust survivors, and everybody had a stroke of luck, because if you didn't have a stroke of luck, you didn't survive.
Yeah. And I think also adding to what I just said a minute ago, Deborah, is the fact that they know she's in the hospital. Yes, they're afraid of infectious disease, but also sending a truck, sending people for one person. Maybe that was not a viable use of their resources at that time. Maybe it's just so there is luck, there's measles, and there's just falling through the cracks of the efficiency of the German system. It's like if there'd been 10 people in hospital, maybe that was enough. I'm speculating, enough worthy of sending some kind of team for, but one. It's amazing for your family, but the thing is, we know that the Nazis it's all about data and numbers, isn't it? That your mother and your mother's sister to the Germans was a statistic. She was a check on a column, and it's all about accountancy. It's all about, for the German point of view, the efficiency of doing this. In your case, it's you're trying to understand your mother's survival and your aunt's failure to survive, but for the Germans, it's just numbers. It's pure accountancy. It's efficiency of an operation. It's chilling. It's chilling how we all know this. Anyone who's watched Schindler's List knows how this system was so ordinary in its efficiency. It was just about crunching paperwork from the German point of view, but in your case, it leads to your mother surviving. It's just truly amazing.
Yeah. So Mum stayed with the nuns for 1 year. A lot of Jewish children were hidden by nuns during the war. I think we've got a photo of, that's my mum too.
Right. Yeah, there we go.
This is not my mum. This is a random French nun with French Jewish children, because it was a secret operation and it was so well organized. This is literally the one piece of the puzzle that I have not been able to find out. I don't know where the convent was or what it was called. Now there's new information coming out all the time. Records are being digitalized. Everything is a lot more accessible, and I'm still finding my mum's names on lists of children's homes, that she was sent to afterwards, blah blah. And but I can't find this out. I went to the Shoah Memorial in Paris. They told me, they gave me contact details for the sisterhood in the area. I've written to the hospital, and they don't have the records. Nobody has any records. And actually somebody, the Wiener Holocaust Library, put me in contact quite recently with Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And there's a historian there who's working on a project about Jewish children who are hidden in convents. So I thought, well, he's got to know. He's got to be able to help, right? I mean, this is exactly what I'm looking for. It turned out that his main source of information was she must be 100 by now. She was 99 at the time. A 99-year-old blind nun, now blind, who, if you describe the habit that the nuns wore, could place the convent.
Wow.
But we didn't know. We didn't have that information. So it was a dead end, unfortunately. And Mum remembered nothing. And this is, I'm sure we'll come to this, but anyway, I'll mention it now. This is one reason, one of many, why I fictionalized the story and changed the names when I wrote my book. Because I had to, I did obviously a lot of research and everything, but I can't be sure if that's, if what I wrote about my mum's year in the convent is all she remembered was taking Holy Communion because it was nice, because she got something to eat and something to drink. And that was kind of like a bit of a family joke.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you at some point about your choice to do a fictionalized version, and well, you explained it there, and also it's we'll talk about it later on. You want your book to not just be a record of your family, but you want it to be an educational tool for other people, and sometimes with a bit of fictionalization, you can adjust the themes and the messages to exactly what you want to do to convey that. So I understand and why your process would be for that way. So
yeah. Also, I never knew my grandparents, you know, and I never knew my uncle and aunt who were murdered. So, you know, and yet I'm writing their personalities, their dialogue, and it just felt, you know, more honest to do it that way.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
So she was in the convent. My mum and her two older brothers, Jacques and Jean, both survived as well. Jacques had a completely different experience, and much of the time he was working on a farm, and here he is. And then he joined the resistance on D-Day. And next slide shows the middle son, Jean. He was, he had incredible adventures. I mean, he was with the Scouts, and he tried to cross over the border to Switzerland, but he couldn't. And then he was hidden in this Catholic boarding school in Toulouse. All the children, all the boys in this photo were Jewish, and the headmaster, you know, knew that they were Jewish, and he hid them, and he had great stories to tell. And then ended up the last few months hiding in the Pyrenees. Anyway, my uncles, these two, they found each other, and then eventually around summer of 1945, they found my mum's name on a list, and they were reunited. The three siblings were reunited. Jean, the middle son, and my mum were sent to a home for displaced Jewish children in Moissac, which is near Toulouse. One of many, many homes. As we know, there were 76,000 French Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and there were an awful lot of orphan children left behind. And so they were in these homes until they could find somewhere, hopefully find a relative somewhere to send them to. And that's what happened after 2 years. My mum was in this home, and they found an aunt in England. And so she was sent to England by herself. She was 9 years old. She didn't speak a word of English, and she was adopted by a cousin. So if you go to the next slide, here she is on her first, at the seaside, on her first holiday with her new adopted parents. So if you go to the next slide,
and just to touch on the DP camps, because we did a wonderful show a few months ago now, Claire Oban, about the DP camps across Europe and how complicated that process is, and how even today, as you were saying about trying to find about the convent your mother was in, there's still information coming out about the DP camps, and it was not just a few thousand here; it was tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and these are people who, by definition, they're lacking identity paper, they're lacking their full histories. They're young people who don't know. And the odd thing is, because Mag is doing her research right now for her show about the Jews in Normandy that's coming on Wednesday, folks, is that we have precise data really for the number of deportees who were killed. It's actually the stories of those who survived and who were looked after are much more complicated to sort out, especially in your mother's case, when they were not old enough to know where they were and what were being done, because the families were sheltering people whose names they didn't know, because it was for their own protection to not know the names. They were passing through. They didn't know where they'd been before. They didn't necessarily know where they were going to on their onward journey. So of course it's understandable there are big gaps in our collective understanding of some of the experiences of the survivors who are of a young age. So it's important that the quest to keep finding these answers continues, so that the more people who watch things like this and read your book, who have maybe one little part of the jigsaw puzzle that can then be shared to create a bigger picture of this incredible story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this photo was taken in 1956 as mum in the and mum on the right, my right, and Uncle Jean, her brother, in the middle, and John's wife Tilly. So he went to the States, and mum went there on holiday. And this is a lovely photo of her looking very happy. And the next photograph, this is me sitting on my mum's lap. I was 1. Giving my age away here, and my sister behind mum, and we were in New York. We were on the ferry, and we went to visit my uncles in New York. So I don't remember it, but I'm sure it was a lovely trip. And yeah, so I think, you know, bearing in mind what she went through, she managed to live, I like to say, a full and happy life. So let's just go back to the book that I told you about at the beginning. So so we got in touch with the publisher, and we got in touch with Denise. And as I said, Denise believed that all the children in this photograph had been murdered at Auschwitz and had no idea that my mum was still alive. So my mum went to the south of France, where Denise lives, and they were reunited after 62 years apart. Very emotional reunion. And I know my mum was very nervous about going because, you know, she didn't know if she wanted to know anything. Denise was obviously very, you know, sensitive about what she told her, and it was a very positive meeting. And they met for many times over the next few years. And I've got a little video. Do you want to play it?
All good things come to an end, and we must say
saying goodbye, but next year we're coming back to see Denise.
we're not saying goodbye, we're saying au revoir, à bientôt.
Little daughter.
Thank you for everything.
This is my little mama.
Right, we've had a lovely time, and we will do it again.
So that always makes me smile. So in the photo from the book, Denise was, you know, towered over my mum. And here my mum towers over Denise, and she's still calling her my little mama, and she was a little mama. And here I am with Denise. I went around 2014 to see Denise in the south of France, and she's still alive. And when I went to see her, she was still living the life, drinking champagne and smoking cigarettes and going down to this lovely restaurant for lunch every day on the beach, and living the life that she deserved, really. And it was wonderful experience. And she was able to give me lots of information and answer lots of questions for my research. So so that was wonderful.
And a question that probably would be better to ask Denise rather than yourself. But for Denise, it must have been the first meeting with her mother must have been something of a difficult one, because obviously she had believed all the children she was looking after had not survived. But finding out one had survived is both a wonderful, joyous thing to find out that one survived, but also a reminder that the others didn't. And she probably over the years had come to terms with that. She wrote her book, and then it's both a difficult experience to then kind of bring it all back up again, having thought that there was a conclusion that was one way, and then the conclusion ended up being different. And it's so how did Denise do a different edition of her book? Did she do a second edition? Or?
No, she didn't. I mean, it was only a small part of her book anyway, because Denise was I think she was in Bergen-Belsen as well.
Okay, yeah. So this is a small chapter.
She had, you know, quite a long story. No, she didn't. She didn't revise it, but you know, yeah, absolutely. It would have been so much easier not to go and not to bring it up. But hey, you know, sometimes exactly.
It's important to put. You know, I'm saying that but it's important to push these things and confront things. I mean, my personal connection with this, in a sense, is that I've had the privilege of taking Normandy veterans to where their friends were killed. I've taken sons and families to where their grandfather was killed in Normandy, and it's something that they're definitely not looking forward to going to where their father was killed, but they feel compelled to do it. And although the experience can often be very, very uncomfortable and bring up all sorts of emotions, they definitely, once they've completed it, and it may not happen till they get back to their respective homes in the USA or Britain, or whatever it be, they definitely are glad they've done it once they've processed the whole thing. But at the time, it can be very difficult. And you know, in my case as a guide, you have to kind of lead them through it and kind of don't force expectations on them and don't tell them what to react and what to feel. And it's a similar thing with this. Anything to do with confronting the era of the Holocaust is going to be very, very complicated and bring up a lot of emotions. And so I'm glad for your family and for Denise's family that this did happen. It was clearly an important part of everybody's putting this behind them.
No, absolutely. So like I said, I went to visit Denise, and then when I was doing my research, this is me at the Shoah Memorial in Paris, where the names of all 76,000 Jewish victims are written. If you go to the next slide, you see my grandparents' names, and we lit a candle by their names. And the next slide, I mean, this was. So it was 1995 when Jacques Chirac acknowledged France's part in the persecution and deportation of Jews during the Second World War. So we'll just park that there.
And by the way, folks, and we covered a lot of this, the Shoah Memorial in Paris with Chris Millington on the show last week. So if you didn't see that one, you would have a bit more understanding about France's role and the complicity in this. Then Chris's show will definitely fill in some of the gaps that Debra has highlighted for us this evening. But so there's more information to find there, and so that's important. And now we come to your book, because it occurred to me. Because when we started communicating, I understood your ancestry and your faith and what have you, because your mother, I'm now thinking that when she was adopted in Britain, she might have been adopted by a Catholic family or a Methodist, or but you as her daughter, you've still got your faith and what have you. So how important is it that you've still got that connection yourself with being Jewish?
Well, my mum was adopted by her cousin.
Yeah.
So, and her aunt became her grandmother.
But we know that lots of people who, when they emigrate, they leave. Particularly with they leave their faith behind. They marry and they.
Absolutely. I mean, you hear of my generation who only find out, at this part of time in their life that they're Jewish because their mother was Jewish, because their parents were afraid to be Jewish after what they went through. I mean, my mum didn't get that choice. In fact, somebody asked me when I was giving this talk once, did your mother continue being a Catholic after spending a year in the convent? Well, I can honestly say my mother never identified as Catholic at all, and I have no idea how, if they tried to convert her, if they hadn't found her name on her list, she may have become a nun herself. I don't know, But she was to England. She was adopted by a Jewish family, and she married my dad, who's Jewish, and we were brought up, in the Jewish faith, and so that's great. I have to say, she wasn't a religious lady. She lost all her faith. She didn't believe in God. She said that if there was a God, he would never have let that happen. When I was young, we kept, a few of the rules and the laws, if you like. But as she got older, she lost any little faith that she had. Yeah, I mean, you see these survivors who speak and they're so forgiving and don't hold a grudge or whatever. That wasn't my mum.
And none of us who were not involved in this can ever judge anybody for dealing with it in whatever way they wanted to. It can reaffirm your faith. It can make you lose your faith. It can make you question it for a while and then find it or not find it again. And whatever journey someone undertakes in this, it's entirely their own personal journey, and we have to just respect it. And so, we need to bring things to an end. Slowly and surely, we're in a world now where, alas, anti-Semitism is still around, and there are David Baddiel's book recently this year about being Jewish in Britain, and genocide still continue around the world. So with your book, and I'll go back to the image of your book again because it seems appropriate. What are your hopes for your book in the sense of being part of this educational process, and what do you think is important for people generally to understand about the whole Holocaust? What are the lessons that we should take forward from your book and generally?
I watched your talk the other day with Noemi and Derek.
Noemi, yeah.
And then, and I agree with everything they said. So, you know, when I give this presentation, and in the text on YouTube, you put generation to generation. This is a charity that I volunteer with, who help prepare this presentation. This is a variation on it. And I go to schools and I talk to students and young people. And the ultimate message is, well, firstly, that this is what happened, and it's so much more impactful for you to hear the story of my mother than, as you said yourself, Paul, hear about the 6 million, all the other numbers that just mean nothing because they're so huge. But the ultimate message is the dangers of racism, hatred, you know, discrimination, being kind, to the importance of being kind to others, of standing up, speaking out. You know, and that's the message that I give. And in fact, they were talking about a school in Hackney where they gave I've also spoken to that school in Hackney. You know, it's amazing. So I do speak to schools where there are a lot of refugee or asylum seeker children, and they can really identify with the story.
I think even in a trivial way, the fact that you go there and you absolutely sound like a Londoner, I think it helps connect with people, because I think sometimes subconsciously, if we hear an Eastern European voice talking about the Holocaust, it somehow disconnects. If we're British or we're American, it disconnects us a little bit from the story. But if you're in an American school and someone goes to speak to you and they've got the same accent you have because they're from Philadelphia or they're from whatever it would be, you know, it helps bring that story to you and remind you this is people around you in your streets and your town were affected by this event. Because I think that's you know, we've been talking during this week about the bringing of the Holocaust and World War II studies together as the same thing. And there are people who study tank battles and aircraft who don't read about the Holocaust and vice versa. But to me, it's the connecting of the two, because the Holocaust was, every one of us knows someone or knows a family that was swept up in this. And by reminding us that it can happen to people who live down the street from us, I think is a way of forewarning ourselves of the potential of these things happening again. Hopefully not, but fear of difference, fear of other peoples with other languages, other faiths is still something that unfortunately grips the world. And so it's important to remind people and arm them with the tools of how to show tolerance and compassion, I think is important.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, when I was writing the book, I realized that it would be suitable for younger people as well. And in fact, a teacher has told me that it's suitable for anybody over the age of 12, because there are, you know, obviously it's a very sad, tragic story, but there are no camp scenes, there are no, you know, so it is accessible. And I know of, you know, when I go and talk in schools, the school library buys copies, and people buy it for their grandchildren. But obviously, I think the majority of readers are adults. And what I just would really. So it's my honor, it's my privilege to speak to people and help keep the memory of my family alive, and that's what I do. And writing the book seemed a good way to help them.
Absolutely. And people have I'm not going to say they enjoyed the show, because in a subject like this you never really enjoy it, but I think they've enjoyed your passion. They've welcomed taking on board this personal story, because you know, you can never have enough personal stories about this event, because as I said at the beginning, it is so much about figures and numbers and the processing of it as a from the German point of view, as a large process of elimination. And actually it's about people and breaking up families, and perhaps even sometimes more heartbreaking if half a family survives and half doesn't survive. It's somehow maybe you either want everyone to survive or everyone not to survive. Some people, you know, a twin surviving is
exactly
inherently awful, because anyone who knows twins, we know of those connections and bonds they have. So, well, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you, Deborah, and I wish you every success with the book. And as usual, folks, the links to Debra's book. Purchase is in the description below. The couple of resources she mentions of websites are in the description below. And I urge people to go out there and find out whatever they can about the Holocaust from whatever point of view you want to. And the fact that your book is suitable for 12-year-olds, because it came up on the Twitter conversation today with people like Jenny Grant, who's coming on in a couple of weeks, talking about Arnhem. She's an educator. You know, she teaches people 13, 14, and there's some things they can't show to children of 12 and 13. There's images they can and can't show. And there's different ways of conveying the Holocaust for different generations. But in my opinion, the earlier you can bring it into people, the better. You just don't bring them in the whole story early. You bring in the idea of hatred first, I think. But even that, you have to handle that sensitively. But it's important that we're educated, and there we go. So,
well, I want to thank you for approaching this subject. And I read everyone's comments on Twitter, and it's really good to see that people are talking about it. So thank you.
Well, that's it. Communication is the main thing, isn't it? So I'll just remind people what coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, I've had to postpone Alina's show when she's talking about Auschwitz. It was going to be tomorrow. It's now going to be Thursday morning UK time, because Alina is just so crazy busy with the amazing work she's doing globally to bring people awareness of the Holocaust. So Alina will be coming to us, but not, as I said, it's changed already. It's Thursday. So our next show is Tuesday evening. Lucinda Fenny is coming on to talk about the Holocaust on film, particularly Eastern European films. But we tend to think of it as a Western point of view of things like Schindler's List as bringing forth the Holocaust for our viewing. But in fact, Polish, Czech, Russian cinema, other nations were confronting the Holocaust even as early as the late 1940s, early 1950s. So Lucinda will be coming on and talking about that, and just how the depiction of the Holocaust has changed over decades, and it's something she studied at university for her PhD. So that'll be very interesting as well. So come and join us for that Tuesday. As usual, don't forget to check us out on Patreon, check us out on Twitter, check Debra out on Twitter, check the book links below. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, Debra Barnes, for joining us. As usual, after a show like this, it was such a harrowing topic, I'll have to go away and kind of decompress for a few minutes. And but it's an important history. So thank you very much for sharing with us, and thank you very much for sharing with all the talks you do about this, because it's just so incredibly important. So this is Paul Woodadge for WW2 TV saying enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I will see you all Tuesday evening with Lucinda. Thanks for watching.